For the last 5,000 years, China was the forefront of human civilization. Ever since the Roman Empire, Europeans heard rumors of the riches of the East. And for centuries to come, China would outpace Europe in every metric of development. When Europeans finally arrived on Chinese shores, the ancient empire wanted nothing to do with them. For what could their measly states offer their immortal dynasty? That was how China saw itself for millennia. Dominant, untouched, unsullied by the outside. And while you can debate whether or not that was actually true, there was a single event that shattered any idea of Chinese supremacy. The Opium War. Folks, it's good to have you back on another episode of No One Is Competent. I am Azalea, your tour guide through the annals of history, highlighting how everyone who's ever been in charge is worse at their job than you are at yours. I am joined, of course, as always, by my illustrious co-host with the research, Jay. How you doing?
I'm doing well. You know, I've got a big mug of tea in front of me. I have a Chinese silver coin. I trust that you have the opioids, and together we can recreate this trade.
You know, I've actually never done opioids, but I blame that besides I think a very mild codeine prescription when I got my wisdom teeth out, but that's mostly because I don't like needles.
That's fair, yeah.
the phobia is
yeah.
I was like having a borderline panic attack as I stood in line for my COVID shots, but I did it. That's what counts. We all have our crosses to bear. I'm glad you're in the mood. What kind of tea?
Oh, this is just Earl Grey tea. It's not actually from China, but close enough.
So, you can follow that beautiful man, Jay, on Twitter at jharrys48. You can follow me on Twitter at Azalea Wyatt. We'll have those links in the description. Our music is done by the glorious, awesome, legendary Sam Bryce, who I will note is getting much better at D&D recently. His performance in our group as our ranger, he's getting a lot more inventive, and I appreciate that, because I rely on him to be sort of the even-handed one, so my character can get a little more wild and crazy with it, which I enjoy, because you know I'm a diva. Anyway, I'll remind you that we are looking for people to review the podcast, please. You know, no ads on this thing, people. Give us a review on Apple Podcasts or interact with your podcasting app as whatever ways. We also like people to subscribe on YouTube. If you watch on YouTube, you can get some visuals to go along with the show. Those visuals vary in quality depending on how stressed out and or interested I am while editing it, but, you know, I generally try my best. If we get up to 10 reviews on Apple, which I think we are close to, and 1,000 YouTube subscribers, I will do a podcast while slammered out of my mind, and Jay will never forgive me for it. If you'd like to reach out to the podcast, you can do so at nooneiscompetent@gmail.com. And speaking of, the reason you would do that is so you could, you know, chat, say hi, call me an asshole, or suggest or request a podcast topic. And this is a requested episode. Isn't that right, Jay?
It is, yeah.
This one goes out to Twitter user Dirty Sexy Love. Now, I'm not going to lie, Jay, I don't know if you did this, but when I saw that person following the two of us, I raised an eyebrow, but I clicked on the profile, I went through the posts, and by all metrics, heuristics, and methods of deduction, this is a real human being. They seem pretty cool.
It's not a links in bio type of deal.
No, they seem to be a chef, actually.
Makes sense.
I won't dox them further, but Mr. Love, thank you for your support of the podcast. I'm glad you liked the show, and I hope that you enjoy this episode. You asked for both Opium Wars. We're doing the First Opium War today, because the second is, one, you've seen the length of this episode. This is already a lot. The Second Opium War goes into, like, the Taiping Rebellion, which is, like, a whole other thing, and it's just better this way, okay? Jay, tell him he's going to have a good time.
Well, I can't guarantee anything, but I hope you
I
enjoy.
can totally guarantee this episode is going to rock your crack. What are our sources, Jay?
Our sources are China's Last Empire, The Great Qing, by William T. Rowe, The Oxford Illustrated History of Modern China by Jeffrey N. Wasserstrom, and The Opium Wars by W. Travis Haynes III and Frank Sinello.
Okay, so if you're not aware, it's really easy to memorize the Chinese dynasties. You just have to sing it to the tune of Frere Jacques. So it's Shang, Zhou, Qin, Han, Sui, Tang, Song, Wan Ming, Qing Republic, Mao Zedong. And if you listen to that closely, you will note that we are in the Qing dynasty, generally thought of as the last Chinese dynasty. And this episode is going to be part of the reason as to why it was the last Chinese dynasty. But before you can understand a fall, you got to have the rise. Otherwise, that shit don't really hit. So Jay, lead us into some background of, who the fuck are these Qing? What's their deal?
So yeah, it's a good topic to bring up. So, for most of the 20th century, the Qing dynasty has indeed been looked back upon in popular memory with a degree of scorn and contempt. In the West, it's remembered as a fetid, decrepit regime, simply the largest of the various Oriental despotates that seemingly existed solely to be picked apart by the great powers of Europe. The legacy of the Qing fared a little better in China, where its rulers were seen as ethnic outsiders who conquered the Han Chinese heartland, only to lead it into stagnation and eventually ruination in the hands of the West. Both of these viewpoints are largely informed by the decline and eventual fall of the Qing dynasty, and thus overlook that for roughly the first half of its history, the story of the Qing is one of an aggressive and successful empire.
So modern China isn't always going out of its way to claim these guys?
Yeah, I feel like in the past decade or two, they've kind of had a bit of a rehabilitation. But in general, no. The Qing were not a popular dynasty in like 20th century Chinese historiography.
Well, I imagine that's mostly an ethnic thing.
Yeah, that is definitely part of it.
And speaking of...
Yeah, that leads us in nicely to our next point, which is that the Qing dynasty's origins lie to the northeast of the Chinese heartland, in the area that is now called Manchuria. In the early 17th century, this area was home to several tribes of people known collectively as the Jurchen or Manchus. Now, contrary to popular belief, the Manchus are not steppe nomads by this point in history, but they've instead transitioned to being sedentary farmers.
That's an easy mistake to make because, like, one of the things I was taught in, like, school was, China's basically, like, always paying off nomads to the north. Sometimes, like, the Mongols conquer with the Yuan, but that's, like, kind of, like, just an ongoing thing over the course of thousands of years. And, like, no, not totally, actually.
Yeah. Yeah. And actually, by this point in time, they're making a fair amount of money from cultivating the herb ginseng and selling that to the Chinese. It was very popular in China. But anyways, as you mentioned, the Chinese do have this long policy of kind of divide and rule when it comes to the northern frontiers. They would invest various chieftains as vassals and play them off one another to prevent any single one of them from becoming too strong. The ancestor of the Qing imperial family, a man named Nurhaci, was one such chieftain. As the power of the then-ruling Ming dynasty of China waned in the early 1600s, Nurhaci was able to consolidate the various Manchu tribes behind his leadership, eventually declaring himself as Khan of the later Jin. That's kind of a reference to the earlier Jin dynasty, which was a Jurchen Khanate. And he does this in 1616. Now, by the early 1600s, the Ming dynasty, as mentioned, was in a state of obvious decline. Famine, plague, and economic turmoil led to a series of peasant rebellions across China. This unrest, in turn, meant that the Ming were unable to reassert their authority over the Manchus. Indeed, only the Great Wall prevented Manchurians from expanding further south. Things finally came to head in 1644 when Beijing was captured by the rebel leader Li Zesheng, and the final Ming emperor committed suicide. Upon receiving this news, the general in charge of defending the Great Wall decided to instead let the Manchurians through and support them in taking the capital. They did so quite quickly, and a new dynasty, the Great Qing, was declared.
So I'm sure what you went through was like an episode all in its own, but like just as a point of interest, that Li fellow, he was not Qing. He was just a separate rebel.
Correct. He is a peasant rebel.
So they capitalized on internal turmoil.
Yeah, the 17th century China is not a fun place. I'm sure you could do a great episode. I'm sure you could write a great novel about it. It's, tons and tons of factions, lots of war. Everything's going on. There's like a pirate warlord who conquers Taiwan and a large part of the coastline. A lot of stuff is going on. And
some real George R.R. Martin shit.
Yeah, the Manchus are the ones who capitalize on it.
The Qing would spend decades fighting rebels and Ming loyalists. Rather than weakening the early Qing state, these campaigns seem to have only encouraged their thirst for conquest, for after consolidating their grip over all of the former Ming dynasty's territory, the Qing set about expanding their rule by launching campaigns all across the frontiers. This period of expansion came to a peak under the Qianlong Emperor, whose famous 10 campaigns saw the Qing wage wars in Xinjiang, Sichuan, Taiwan, Tibet, Nepal, Burma, and Vietnam. Damn, they got Vietnam? That shit's hard.
Yep.
By the 1760s, the Qing had doubled the territory of their Ming predecessors, making their empire the largest in Chinese history. I mean, I guess that kind of makes sense why the modern Chinese wouldn't like them, because they successfully conquered Vietnam, and the modern Chinese, blows on nail polish.
An episode we may or may not ever do.
I really
finding good information on it is like a nightmare.
Because I feel like 14 people in America know that the Chinese invaded Vietnam like right after we left, and also got their asses kicked.
Yeah,
that is always hilarious. It's like today you're like, oh, Vietnam then went to the communists, and you like fast forward. It's like, why is Vietnam today closer to the U.S. than with China?
Yep.
All right, so my shade aside, these conquests would not have been possible if the Qing had been incompetent rulers. The Qing absorbed the pre-existing Ming bureaucracy and augmented it with its own Manchu hierarchy, creating a sort of dual administration that proved effective at stabilizing China after the turbulent 17th century. Economic growth and internal trade flourished, with China's cities not only recovering but even growing in size. Side note, the 17th century was kind of ass like all across the world.
Yeah, you got the 30 Years' War, all that fun
Europe
shenanigans going on, yeah.
I mean, they made a podcast about it literally called Hell on Earth. But yeah. Just as another side note. This period of Qing strength has become known as the High Qing era, and is typically seen as lasting from the 1680s to the death of the Qianlong Emperor in 1799. During this period, many Chinese citizens enjoyed a quality of life that was in no way inferior to those in Europe. And remember that for most of agriculture human history, people in China are enjoying greater technology and whatnot than in Europe. Some historians would dub this century as the start of the, quote, Great Divergence, a series of trends that saw the Western world surpass the Old World civilizations such as China, Persia, India, and the Ottomans. Yet for those living in China during the High Qing, such a divergence would have seemed far from likely. However, in spite of China's general wealth and prosperity under the Qing, cracks in the system were already beginning to show by the end of Qianlong's long rule.
The period of Qing rule saw massive growth in the population of China. More advanced agricultural practices, better strains of rice, and new world crops such as maize and potatoes led to a population explosion.
Potato low-key be one of, the greatest inventions in human history.
Yeah. And when you combine this with the territorial growth, the end result is that the Qing ended up ruling over 3 times as many people as their Ming predecessors.
Damn.
Yeah, I mean, I think I read that the Qing had potentially a third of the world's population at their height. Population growth within the Chinese heartland may have been driven by more efficient agriculture, but it soon began to snowball out of control. The amount of acreage of farmland per capita dropped to less than half an acre per person. Now, in the past, such drops had coincided with increased productivity. This was when the labor, rather than the land, had traditionally been in short supply. Basically, if you have more people per land, you're working the land more effectively and making more food. Now, however, this dynamic reversed. The potential pool of labor was in excess of what was needed, leading to a decline in the standard of living in much of the countryside.
A lot of people see, Ludditism or, people disliking modernization or mechanization being like, oh, they're so silly. They're standing in the way of progress. And everyone forgets that, that often means, in the short term, that people are, unable to feed their kids.
Yeah.
There's people don't just say, ooh, new thing bad. They have economic reasons for their opinions.
Indeed. And to make matters worse, the ability for the Chinese state to handle this growing population was limited by constraints on the bureaucracy. The Qing dynasty, like the previous imperial dynasties of China, governed largely through the mandarins, bureaucrats appointed to regional and national posts after passing rigorous exams. If you've taken any AP World History class, this is one of the first things you learn about China.
And unlike AP World History, those exams, will kill you.
Yeah.
They were, you study for a decade plus.
Yeah. Now, the Qing were not lacking for these would-be mandarins. Indeed, peace, urbanization, and general population growth led to a similar growth in the scholarly classes that traditionally supplied such men. The problem is that the Qing lacked the ability to employ all of them. In 1711, the Qing emperor issued an edict promising never to raise the land tax, which was a bit of a problem because land taxes formed 80% of the government's income. Subsequent rulers were reluctant to break from this for fear of alienating both peasants and powerful landowners. This meant that the growth of the bureaucracy was effectively capped at a time in which the amount of people and the land it had to manage was increasingly great.
It also meant that there was a glut of unemployed scholars, individuals who passed the exam but were never given posts due to lack of jobs. This is besides the people who studied their entire life and didn't even pass.
Yeah, and then go on to declare themselves the brother of Jesus Christ.
I was about to make that joke, you asshole. I mean, what if he was the brother of Jesus Christ? Hear him out. Sure. Jesus had brothers. There's one named James. I think there were more. That was a thing. So by 1800, there were an estimated 1.4 million degree holders. Men who had passed some form of an imperial exam, but only 20,000 available openings in the bureaucracy. The leftovers constitute a large, well-educated, and potentially politically subversive elite. Both of these things undermine the effectiveness of a government. Now, imagine you grow up seeing status of living becoming more tenuous all around you. You spend your entire childhood studying to do this thing that is like your one ticket for you and your family to get out of poverty, and then... and you have all of these ideas, and you have all of this learning and nothing to do with it. When I worked at Starbucks for a while, a lot of my coworkers were people who had college degrees, but couldn't find a job in their preferred field. And I took a lot of glee in informing them that statistically speaking, from a historical standpoint, people like them have overthrown a lot of governments. So, return to tradition. Perhaps most obviously detrimental to the effectiveness of Qing rule, however, was the vast corruption that arose towards the end of the 18th century. Positions in the bureaucracy were increasingly bought and sold, further angering the scholarly class. I'm going to go off on another tangent and say that corruption always rises when people cannot make ends meet through official means. So this economic precarity, I am absolutely certain encouraged this shit.
Yeah.
Generally, the reason that a cop is like stopping you in the middle of the street and asking you to pay him to keep driving is because his pay is not enough. Also because all of the other cops are doing it. That's generally the two main reasons. Positions in the bureaucracy were increasingly bought and sold, further angering the scholarly class. Perhaps most emblematic of the rot that had already begun to set in was the astronomical rise of a guardsman by the name of Hessian. Quoting from China's Last Empire. In 1775, he was noticed by the aging Qianlong emperor, who, it was said, saw in him a resemblance to a palace lady he had courted unsuccessfully in his youth. Within 2 years, the infatuated emperor had heaped upon Hessian some 20-odd bureaucratic appointments, including membership of the Grand Council and the presidencies of the Board of Revenue and Board of Civil Office. Through elaborate patronage networks whose protection was guaranteed by his personal hold over the emperor, Hessian orchestrated systematic embezzlement of all levels of the Qing administration. Virtually no official appointment was made without a contribution to one of Hessian's many henchmen, and approvals for even the most glaringly necessary official projects were issued only after payment of personal gifts to superiors up the chain of command. Unsurprisingly, fewer and fewer of the critical tasks of government actually got done. This is a reminder for all of our audience that the governments are just made of dudes. History is just made of dudes and dudettes. People just trying to get an advantage in their day-to-day. Most people, even the rulers of nations, are not thinking of like this grand strategy of how our country is going to outcompete all of the others. You want to stuff your pocket and fuck bitches. Like this, they're just like us.
Yeah. And I think it's also worth remembering that this is pretty much universal. I say that because Europeans around this time period will start creating stereotypes. One of them is like the idea of Eastern or Oriental despotism, that the people of the East are naturally predisposed to these corrupt, despotic governments ruled by effeminate bureaucrats and courtiers and whatnot.
And that shit goes all the way back to Herodotus, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Like that is literally a 3,000 plus year old stereotype.
Yeah. And it's definitely getting reinforced in this time period. But I see this as, A, something that can happen anywhere, corruption, obviously, and B, a trait that is particularly common wherever you have kind of an absolutist or a monarchical system. We've talked a lot about the Ancien regime of France. We talked a little bit about the Bourbons in Spain. We've talked about Russia. You have these same things.
Remember that the French Empire, like the French Revolution, only happened because the crown ran out of money because they couldn't raise the taxes effectively. This is a similar situation.
Yeah, and Within Chinese historiography, traditional historiography, there is sort of the idea of like you have a cycle where you have a new dynasty come in. The first couple of emperors are like warlords or people who actually had to like conquer or do stuff. And then after a few generations, you get people who are kind of born in the purple, end up being a little bit pampered, a bit isolated and dominated by their courtiers. And that's when the corruption starts to really set in. Obviously, this doesn't always happen, but I feel like that's definitely something that's happening in this case. Now, the effects of population growth, ineffectual bureaucracy, and corruption came to head in the late 18th century in an event known as the White Lotus Rebellion. The White Lotus Rebellion had its origins in the mountainous highlands of Hubei and Shanxi provinces in central China. Internal immigration and new forms of agriculture had brought about massive population growth in this region during the early period of Qing rule. But erosion and exhaustion of the topsoil led to a sharp decline in productivity by the late 1700s.
It's all agriculture, people.
Yes. The imperial bureaucracy did little to help, and in fact exacerbated the situation through excessive taxes levied on the population in what was basically an extortion racket being run by Hessian's underlings. The peasants of the highlands, faced with a difficult life and little opportunity, increasingly turned to religion for guidance and support. An old millenarian Buddhist movement known as the White Lotus found new converts, its leaders preaching violent revolution in preparation for the coming apocalypse. The White Lotus Rebellion, or really rebellions as it was kind of a series of uprisings by loosely organized cells, there was no real centralized leadership, broke out in 1796, quickly engulfing up to 5 provinces in sectarian violence. This came at an inopportune time for the Qing, as it coincided with a rebellion by the ethnic Miao minority of Hunan province, and once again corruption played a role in making the situation worse. Quoting from the Oxford Illustrated History of Modern China, quote, "It was here that Hessian's pyramid of corruption made itself felt most severely, for he himself was in charge of the campaigns, and his chosen henchmen supervised the fighting on the ground. An unheralded level of graft entered the military campaigns. By the peak of the war, officers were reporting and demanding salaries for over 1 million militia troops, many of which didn't actually exist. Their salaries were going directly into the pockets of the military leaders themselves, with hefty kickbacks to Hessian besides. Even worse, the generals in charge of fighting the White Lotus appeared to have prolonged the conclusion of the war for several years after it might have otherwise ended, allowing the fighting to go on solely that they could ensure a constant flow of funding from the government."
Jay, can we do a Hessian episode?
Maybe.
This guy seems kind of dope.
I need to find if somebody's written a good book on him, then maybe.
Also, White Lotus Rebellion is that's a good that's some peak anime shit. That's a good title. I like that. Hessian's extreme avarice was plain for all to see, and upon Qianlong's death in 1799, he was immediately arrested and executed by new Emperor Jiaqing. Jiaqing?
Yeah.
By the way, audience, I just want y'all to know that Jay was complaining about people not pronouncing things properly on Twitter the other day, and he didn't even have the decency to at me, because he is a coward without valor. By 1804, Jiaqing was able to bring the rebellion to a close, though isolated sectarian violence would continue for decades to come. The war had plunged China into debt. Jiaqing slashed military funding as a response. A well-meaning attempt to combat corruption, but one that meant that the Qing would enter the 19th century with a demoralized, outdated military. And in spite of his efforts, much of the corrupt practices remained, a result of Jiaqing's inability to purge the bureaucracy of Hessian's numerous appointees. It was thus through the confluence of a few key factors that China entered the 19th century in an increasingly precarious state. Yet alongside these more familiar factors was an additional one, more basic, yet just as deadly, an addiction to one of the most ancient drugs, opium, supplied in ever-increasing amounts by a foreign power that only recently stretched its tendrils into East Asia, the British Empire.
The British were relative latecomers to the trade with China, only arriving in number by the 1680s. Their timing was ideal, however, as this coincided with the reign of the outwards-looking Qing Emperor, who encouraged trade along the length of China's coast. Trade with China was the sole responsibility of the British East India Company, which had been granted a monopoly over the trade by the government. For the merchants of the East India Company, China offered a great many riches: silk, porcelain, spices, and herbs, proving to be as popular in England as they were throughout much of Europe. One good would become particularly valuable: tea, which exploded in popularity throughout the 18th century.
Which is also a drug, let us not remember. It's all drugs. All the way down.
At the start of the century, the East India Company was importing 200 pounds of the stuff into England each year. By the end of the century, that figure had risen to 28 million. This voracious appetite for tea and other Chinese goods left the East India Company with a conundrum, however, as the British in turn had little to offer the Chinese. British goods simply weren't seen as that desirable in China. Some headway was made in the 1700s with cotton, grown in the company's Indian plantations, but cotton alone was not enough to cover British expenses.
I love how there's several letters from the Chinese in the 1600s just being go away.
Yeah.
You are dirty and you have nothing we want.
Yeah. Yeah, so this means that silver bullion was the only other Western product in high demand in China. The end result was a typical trade imbalance, with English silver flowing into China in exchange for Chinese goods. This trade imbalance was seen as problematic for a few reasons. Under the then-dominant theory of mercantilism, it was the exact opposite of good economic practice. A nation was meant to amass bullion and export goods. Additionally, Britain's access to silver was not entirely secure. The bulk of the world's silver production at the time was controlled by her on-again, off-again rival Spain. For example, the British supply dropped when Spain sided with the 13 colonies during the American Revolution. The need to find a good that the British could sell to China was thus seen as paramount. The answer was found in the form of opium.
Side out, there's several points in history where Spanish mining of silver in Latin America, crashes the Chinese economy with inflation halfway around the world.
Yeah.
This is different. That's different podcast.
Yeah.
All right. Let's talk about drugs. Opium is a substance, a natural latex, in fact, extracted from the seed capsules of the opium poppy plant. So there's poppy seeds on your bagel and shit. Those technically do have trace amounts of some of the stuff, but you're really harvesting stuff that's deeper. This sort of milky, a latex substance that's in the poppy plant. It contains addictive analgesic elements that can be refined chemically into things like morphine, codeine, and thebaine. What the fuck? I've never heard of that one. What is that?
Thebaine?
Thebaine?
Yeah, it's an addictive compound.
That I don't like that word. I don't like the way that sparks no joy. By the way, in case you're wondering, scientists in the late 1800s would mess around with morphine. They would add 2 methyl groups onto it, thus calling it diamorphine. And they tried to sell that. They weren't super successful, and so guys diamorphine is a bad name. Let's just call it heroin. And then that started to go off. So if you ever wonder what heroin is, that's what heroin is. It's juiced up morphine, and morphine is refined opium. Now, when consumed, opium can, of course, serve to reduce pain, combat diarrhea, and induce a sort of euphoric daze I'm sure none of our listeners are familiar with. Have you ever been on any opiates, Jay, for an operation or something?
I also had a wisdom teeth removal and had, I'm assuming, codeine painkillers, but I didn't take them for very long.
Were you disappointed? I remember taking them being like, oh, like, not really getting any fun effects here.
Yeah,
I guess
really
that
notice
was
much.
good, but like 17-year-old Azalea was like, shit, I want to get high. Guess I'm just going to have to shotgun the bottle of Robitussin.
Yeah, you either got to be that or you got to be like House. And then those are the two outcomes.
Did you know anybody who was robo-tripping when you were in high school?
No.
From what I've heard, it is a very uncomfortable high that it involves a lot of weird out-of-body experiences. But I only know like 2 people who've done it. Small domino. Jay talks to a guy about politics in an anime Discord server. Large domino. Jay learns what robo-tripping is.
Don't worry, I'm probably going to forget about it in a few days.
I'm so proud of myself. Opium poppy has been cultivated since the Bronze Age, and its medicinal properties were known to the ancient Mesopotamians, the Egyptians, Greeks, everybody. For most of its history, Turkey and the Middle East were the main areas of opium cultivation. These days, Afghanistan is, of course, the prime area.
Actually, the Taliban in the past few years have really stomped it out.
Yeah, because like the heroin market in Europe is like in shambles, and like prices are skyrocketing, right?
Yeah.
I wrote about that, and of course, this is why people start turning to fentanyl, which don't do fentanyl. Of course, you probably don't know whether or not you've done fentanyl because it's very hard to tell. Test your drugs, people. Just test your fucking drugs.
I actually didn't know that.
Yeah, no, so fentanyl is a purely synthetic compound made out of various chemicals that are generally bought from China. And then it's like for the U.S., a lot of it's like made in Mexico, but like it's there's no there's no like grown. Obviously, there's organic compounds in it from a chemical standpoint, but it's not grown at all, and that's kind of part of the problem. Is you can like smuggle in the chemicals relatively easily, and then you can cook it in small labs, very similar to meth, and it's very, very hard to clamp down on. That's I just watched some stuff and did some research into the fentanyl epidemic. It's really terrifying.
I see. Yeah.
Especially for some of the small towns in Georgia that my family comes from. Man, this podcast is going to be like 3 hours long. I keep doing all these fucking tangents. All right. So during the Middle Ages, opium fell out of common use in much of Europe. But in the 16th century, its popularity began to make a bit of a comeback. This accelerated in the mid-1700s after the British East India Company gained control over the opium-producing regions in India. In Europe, opium was typically dissolved in alcohol to form laudanum, a tincture that became seen as sort of a cure-all drug, prescribed by doctors for all manners of ailments. Of course, this has become a problem when people started getting more and more addicted to opiates in Europe, but then people found a great cure for heroin and whatnot called cocaine. Addiction to laudanum became somewhat commonplace amongst the upper classes in 19th century Britain. Opium had been consumed in China too, since at least the Middle Ages, introduced to the country by Arab merchants. By the 1600s, individuals in China had begun to consume the drug in a different manner, blending opium with tobacco and smoking it through a pipe. This method led to a more intense and prolonged high than consuming it orally. It was also far more addictive. Taking note of the pre-existing consumption of opium in China, the British saw the drug as a way of reducing or potentially even reversing their trade imbalance. The East India Company began shipping opium to China in the 1700s. By 1800, the trade represented an important part of the company's revenue. During the early period of the opium trade, the company acted in a relatively cautious manner to avoid conflict with Chinese authorities, who had already issued decrees against the sale and use of the drug. Opium was sold at auction in India to private merchants, who then bore the risk of actually shipping the drug to China. The trade was capped at around 500 chests per year, and a chest is like 170 pounds of opium. Think of like a big old pirate chest.
As a note, that's 5,000 chests, not 500.
Ah, my bad. Thank you, Jay. 5,000 chests per year, 170 pounds of opium per chest. You can do the math on your phone. An amount that balanced Britain's trade equilibrium with China. This kept opium prices high because, you're restricting supply, and it limited the drug to the upper classes, preventing too much in the way of social disruption. The upper classes, they get addicted to shit. It's like, who cares? I'm not really doing anything important anyway. Great lesson from history for the modern days. The East India Company's control over the opium trade was not to last forever. By the 1820s, Indian states that were not under British control began growing their own opium and selling it to private merchants, who in turn smuggled the opium to China. Finally, in 1833, the Whig government in Britain ended the company's monopoly over trade with China, effectively throwing open the door for private firms to enter the opium business. Americans, French, Portuguese, and Indian merchants all got involved in the opium trade, though British firms remained the largest. Competition led to greater volume and lower costs, allowing opium to spread beyond the upper classes. By the late 1830s, over 300,000 chests of opium, so that's a six-fold increase, were making its way to China every year, enough to reverse the equilibrium and supply millions of addicts. Jay, I know this is kind of later in the script, but can we talk just briefly? The East India Company, I don't imagine they ever got, approval from the crown to start dealing in opium, because the vast majority of their decisions were made pretty independently.
That's correct.
And it is, really wild how little oversight and whatnot they had. This is often taught in history as, the British got the Chinese hooked on opium. Like it was they sat around in a shadow council and drumming their fingers against one another. It's like, yes, we will addict these Chinese barbarians to our drug. No, it was just dudes. It was just dudes trying to make money in a very distributed way. It was a lot less central than it's presented in cursory history books.
That's correct, yes.
Yeah, it was probably hidden from a lot of the people back home exactly what they were dealing with in terms of the drug trade and shit.
Yeah. And, like we mentioned, the East India Company wanted to keep it relatively limited in terms of the amount of opium that they were shipping. But this is around the time you have a lot of economic liberalism becomes really popular in Britain. And the part of that is getting rid of monopolies and promoting free trade. And that's, as you mentioned, one of the things that really, it's not necessarily a state policy to sell more opium. It's a state policy regarding an aspect of the economy that has the end result in more opium being sold.
So did the East India Company limit the opium trade out of fear of the substance, or did they just didn't think it'd be useful to sell more, or what was with the restraint? That's usually not like them.
From what I could tell, they feared of repercussions from the Chinese government, that the Chinese would, as we'll see later, try to end the trade and thereby, cut the East India Company off entirely from trade with China. They were essentially being cautious. And, they're operating in the point in time where, they don't necessarily have the military strength to overawe the Chinese. Or they don't think that it's, a surefire bet that if they go to war, that A, the East India Company will be supported by the British government, and B, that they would win a military conflict. So better safe than sorry.
Very important to know when we talk about like the West conquering over the East that took a long time before the West thought they could take a good shot.
Most of India at this point in time is not under British control. The East India Company is basically going to individual Indian, states, little principalities and whatnot, one by one, conquering some, making deals with some, having some become protectorates. So they're very much still in the process of firming up their grip in India. And actually, there are a few big wars in India during the late 1700s, which is probably another reason why they don't want a war with China.
Yes, because they're still subduing that subcontinent, which of course took a lot longer and was a lot bloodier than people remember.
Yeah.
So just to summarize, the East India Company, they get the opium grown in parts of India, then they sell it to independent traders, who then sell it to the Chinese, and the cash that they get from doing that selling, then the East India Company goes to China and uses that cash to trade for goods that they then sell at home.
Yes.
Just wanted to make clear the order of operations, everything. All right, so go on.
Yeah, so regardless of the nationality of the shipping firm, the destination of all Western ships transporting opium and other goods to China was singular.
I love that old tradition. It's like, this one place is where we're going to deal with all the fucking foreigners. I don't want to see them anywhere else.
Yeah. And for context, Canton is today known as Guangzhou. Probably pronouncing it incorrectly, but yeah.
Still a very, very large city.
Very much so, yeah. So Canton was located in the Guangdong province in southern China, in an area that's called the Pearl River Delta. This is an extensive estuary formed where the Pearl River empties into the South China Sea. On the eastern side of the mouth of this estuary is Macau, which had been a Portuguese possession since 1577. Technically, they were leasing it. Directly opposite of Macau, on the western side of the estuary, is Hong Kong, at that point in time an unassuming island, home to a few small fishing villages. Further up the estuary lay Canton, a city of roughly 1 million inhabitants. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, Canton had become the prime site for European trade with China, owing to its proximity to Southeast Asia. Basically, if you're sailing from India or Thailand or Indonesia, wherever, Canton's, naturally going to be the first place you stop off. Now, in the 1750s, the Qianlong Emperor implemented the Canton system, thereby restricting Western trade solely to Canton, so now it's the only place you can stop off. These merchants, in fact, were not allowed into the city proper most of the time, but instead were restricted to a small trading district just south of the city.
And I imagine they're like jockeying for like literal dock space.
Yeah. Yeah. Here they would store their goods, conduct their business, and live in a series of storehouses known as the factories. They were allowed to reside in the factories only during the trading season, which was roughly speaking around October to January, and most would spend the remainder of the year in Macau or going back to India or somewhere else. As a note, this regulation would kind of be relaxed by the 1830s or so.
But it illustrates just how in control the Chinese government was of this trade.
Yes. As a side note, opium in specific was generally not brought into the factories. Rather, foreign ships carrying opium generally transferred their cargo to Chinese smugglers on offshore rafts or the various small islands that dotted the area, before continuing on to conduct more legal trade in Canton. This is because the Chinese will make opium illegal in the 1700s. All trade flowing through Canton was managed by a guild of Chinese merchants known as the Kohong, who also served as intermediaries between Western merchants and the Chinese government. These Chinese merchants bought the opium, even though, again, it was illegal to do so, and distributed it throughout the country, profiting as much from the trade as their Western suppliers. Indeed, the wealthiest of the Kohong, a merchant named Wu Bingjian, was by some estimates the richest man on earth during the 1830s. While the British Parliament abolished the company's monopoly over trade with China in 1833, they recognized the need to have some sort of overseeing body to interact with the Kohan. Actually, the Chinese are basically like, we need you to have like a guy we can speak with. Previously that would be, the company director. Now, what the British will do is that they'll create a position known as the Chief Superintendent of Trade.
While the opium trade brought great wealth to those involved in it, the detrimental effects it had on Chinese society and the economy were increasingly evident. Most obvious of these effects was the scourge of addiction. Opium dens cropped up across China, particularly in the south. Most of China's population is in the south, right? Even today?
Yeah.
Here, customers gathered to smoke opium and laze about, often for days on end. Have you ever been inside of, like, a cigar store, Jay?
Yes.
So, there's, like, generally, like, a place in the back with some couches to enjoy. And, like, there's always some, like, 40-year-old, like, African-American gentlemen who are back there in my local shop. And it's, like, it feels like they came with the building. Like, it's their hangout joint.
Yeah.
I don't smoke cigars. So addiction was particularly prevalent amongst members of the military and bureaucracy, further straining the effectiveness of the Qing administration. And also remember, economic times are bad. There's not enough jobs for people. We see in America today that also affects rates of addiction, right?
Yes.
As the number of addicts soared, so did the amount of silver leaving the nation. Like their European counterparts, Chinese officials abhorred a trade imbalance. Now, for possibly the first time in Chinese history, more silver bullion was leaving Chinese each year than entering the country. As silver grew more scarce, its value relative to copper rose, and this posed further problems. Peasants and tradesmen held most of their wealth in copper cash coins, but written taxes typically had to be paid in silver taels. Ideally, one silver tael was worth 1,000 copper cash. We're kind of going by vague D&D rules. By the 1830s, it could require between 1,500 to 2,600 cash coins to exchange for one silver tael. The rising value of silver thus made it more difficult to pay rent and taxes, plunging many into debt and poverty, places where you are likely to turn to addiction for escape. As a note, the scarcity of silver was not solely a result of the opium trade. The trade had the misfortune of coinciding in a global reduction in silver output as a result of, does anyone want to guess? Anybody? What's going on in the world at the time? Yes, the Latin American Wars of Independence, and a lot of people in Argentina and Chile don't want to be worked to death for silver anymore, and that was good. But also, damn, those rents in Xinjiang going up.
Yeah. Fun fact: cash is a loan word we get from China.
Really?
Yeah, that is when you say cash coins, that's literally what they were called, cash. That's it made its way into English as a loan word.
Fascinating.
Now, up to this point, we've been discussing the relationship between Britain and China purely along the lines of trade. And that's pretty much because trade was the extent of this relationship. There was no diplomatic relationship or even effective contact between the two governments. This was the result of a fundamental difference in worldview between the two empires. Now, our modern idea of international diplomacy, with states interacting with each other through ambassadors, consulates, and the like, is of fundamentally European origin, born in the early modern era in a continent that had no overwhelmingly dominant power. The British, for example, could not simply treat the French, Austrians, or Russians as subjects. If they wanted to come to some sort of agreement on some matter, they had to recognize the other power as their equal. The Chinese outlook on the way affairs were to be conducted between nations was fundamentally different. Save for periods of civil war, China was used to being the politically and economically dominant power in East Asia. Geography separated her from other traditional bases of power, such as Persia and India. The Chinese will obviously trade with the Persians and Indians, but you're not going to have much in the way of war or whatever because, you have giant deserts and mountains and whatnot in between these areas. Now, this dominance gave credit to the idea that China was the center of the world, literally the Middle Kingdom. Those not under Chinese rule were barbarians. They may choose to pay tribute to the Chinese emperor, in which case they would in turn see recognition not as equals but as subordinates. If they did not, then there would be no diplomatic relationship.
Kowtow.
Yep. Their merchants could still trade with China, but the relationship would be purely mercantile. The British had attempted to open up diplomatic relations with China in 1793, sending the statesman George Macartney to the Qing court with a ship full of gifts, including, among other things, modern firearms, cannons, scientific instruments, and a model of a steam engine, as well as instructions to request the establishment of a permanent embassy in Beijing and the opening of ports besides Canton to British trade. He also received permission to offer to put an end to the then still relatively nascent opium trade. Macartney's gifts, of course, were seen by the Qing as tribute. When Macartney was informed that he must kowtow, a series of 3 kneelings and 9 prostrations in front of the Qianlong emperor in order to receive an audience, he balked at the obvious implication. Macartney then proposed that he would kowtow if a Qing official of equal rank would in turn kowtow to a portrait of King George III. This was refused.
I mean, who's going to kowtow to George III? I mean, let's be honest here.
Not even in the top 3 of King George's, and that's a pretty low bar.
At least he spoke English.
That is fair. Now, eventually, it's agreed upon that Macartney would only have to kneel before the emperor, as he would before his own king, and perform a single prostration. While he did receive an audience with Qianlong, the British were subsequently sent on their way with no negotiations having taken place. Qianlong went so far as to send a scathing letter to the British king, informing him that, quote, "As your ambassador can see, we possess all things. I set no value on objects strange or ingenious, and have no use for your country's manufacturers."
I kind of love the statement, "We possess all things." That's so blunt it becomes witty. So the failure of the Macartney embassy gave light to the fundamental difference in worldview between the British and Chinese governments. A similar effort in 1816 by William Amherst proved even less effective, with the British envoy being refused an audience with the emperor. Of course, the opium trade continued unabated. A third attempt at establishing more formal diplomatic relations between Britain and China took place in 1834. This time, the result would be more dramatic. The envoy in 1834 was William Napier, who was also the first chief superintendent of trade. Napier, like Macartney before him, was instructed to request the opening of fur ports to the British and the establishment of an embassy in Beijing. Perhaps due to his military background or his position as chief superintendent, Napier was far more reckless than Amherst or Macartney. While he did not bother to seek an audience in Beijing, he instead sailed to Canton in July, an illegal act because that's outside that trade season we mentioned, and attempted to open negotiations with the Viceroy of Canton rather than communicate through the Chohong. His reasoning was that he was a political envoy, not a merchant, and thus the laws created for Western merchants did not apply to him. What followed was a diplomatic standoff, with the Chinese threatening to embargo British goods and Napier refusing to leave Canton. Indeed, the superintendent fanned the flames by ordering a further 3 British ships into Canton. Chinese forts guarding the Pearl River opened fire, but were unable to do any damage due to the antiquated nature of their artillery. The British responded, knocking out a fort, continuing onwards. However, once the British ships had reached Canton, they found themselves trapped, for the Chinese blocked the way out with barges, fire ships, and an iron chain. We did mention Game of Thrones shit. The fire ships in particular posed a danger to the British vessels. Napier continued his posturing, but he was simply bluffing. His instructions had been to avoid military conflict, so no reinforcements would be on their way.
Now, throughout the course of this incident, the superintendent had been goaded by the opium traders who hoped his actions would escalate into a full-scale war, after which the obviously victorious British would be able to dictate their terms to the Qing. The government back in England, however, viewed the whole affair as more of an embarrassing error than anything else. By the time news reached Britain of Napier's death, the Whig government that had sent him had fallen, replaced by a Tory government with a more isolationist mindset. The new foreign minister, the Duke of Wellington, summed up the view of the government as such. Quote, "The attempt to force upon the Chinese authorities at Canton an unaccustomed mode of communication with an authority whose powers and whose nature they had no knowledge of had failed, as it is obvious that such an attempt must invariably fail and lead again to national disgrace." I also like that quote because it does kind of show that there are people in Britain who realize that we can't just act like China is France and be like, oh yeah, we're going to send an ambassador to Beijing like you would to Paris. There are people smart enough to realize that you have to deal with cultural differences. But yeah. Unfortunately, that view was not shared by many, I suppose. Napier's fizzle, as it would come to be known, had little impact on the opium trade. His successors struck a more conciliatory tone and trade resumed in Canton. This did have the effect of lulling the Qing into a false sense of security. From their perspective, the British had clearly been cowed into submission and thus posed little threat to China's security.
Quick question, but it's still clear, to the opium traders and that Britain would win a war.
Yeah.
But the British are not chomping on the bit for it. I guess partially because they don't even control all of their forces in this area.
Yeah, at the moment, at this point in time, and this is 1834, the British are not necessarily oh yeah, we're going to war. Right now, it's not clear that'll happen. But the traders think that if it does happen, that the British will win. Napier only had 3 ships, so he was not going to win a war on his own, but yeah. So anyways, the Qing government was not unaware of the cost that opium was having on their economy and society. Numerous edicts were issued banning the sale, possession, and consumption of opium, but none of these had been effective. By the 1830s, debate arose within the government over what the best course of action was. Some of the Daoguang emperor's advisors, he was now the emperor since he came to power in 1820, advocated for the legalization of opium. If opium was made legal, it could be regulated and taxed, helping to bolster the Qing's declining treasury.
A reminder to everybody to remember the difference between legalization and decriminalization.
Yep.
Legalization means tax.
Yes. Or indeed, the government could potentially even establish its own monopoly over the sale of the drug. Others pushed for eradication, a war on opium, with both its sellers and buyers in the crosshairs. In 1838, the emperor made the decision to back the hardliners. One of their chief members, Lin Zeshe, a governor who had suppressed the opium trade in Hubei and Hunan provinces, was appointed to the newly created position of High Commissioner of Canton.
Note that the Hubei and Hunan province are pretty far inland in China. They're not I don't think they're the most populous at this time, and they're probably not like, I doubt they had like the most flourishing opium trade, because they're not
on
close
the front
to the
lines
ports.
of it. Yeah.
So this is like if you put like the governor of Iowa in charge of New York City drug enforcement.
Yeah. Indeed.
So Lin Zexu arrived in Canton with a permit to crush the opium trade and presumably a horrendous accent. He wasted little time in getting started. Edicts were issued making the penalties of getting involved with opium clear. Foreign and Chinese merchants involved in the sale of opium, corrupt officials who tolerate the trade, and addicts who failed to turn in their drugs within 18 months were all to suffer the death penalty. Unlike past officials, Lin Zexu was intent on enforcing these policies. By the spring of 1839, he had arrested 1,600 residents of Canton and seized 3,000 chests of the drug. And remember, a chest is about 170 pounds. Okay, so that's a lot, but like, that's not a ton.
Yeah. Yeah.
Lin also wrote a letter to Queen Victoria demanding that she halt British involvement in the opium trade, but this letter would end up getting delayed in transit. Of course, Lin knew that the amount of chests that he had managed to seize in Canton was just a drop in the bucket, as I probably should have read it in the script. Fuck it! Just offshore, there were over 20,000 chests aboard ships laying at anchor at the Pearl River Delta, waiting to be transferred to Chinese smugglers. As Lin began to put pressure on the Cohong merchants, some of them advised that the British should leave Canton or voluntarily give up their opium, as Lin had promised clemency for those who did so. Most of the British did neither. Finally, on March 18th of 1839, Lin arrested the 12 head members of the Cohong, accusing them, quite accurately, of being involved in the opium trade and requesting that they convince the British to turn over all remaining chests of opium. If the Cohong failed to get an agreement from the British within 3 days, Lin would begin executing their members. So he's putting pressure on the Chinese officials, but he's not directly threatening the British officials yet.
Correct.
This is interesting. And I'm sure like these Brits are like, I mean, we've been doing trade like this for decades. Why are you suddenly harshing the vibe, bro?
Yeah.
And also, like, remember, governments can't stop drugs coming into their country now. Like, the United States government, the most powerful force in the history of mankind, can't do it. So, shrugs in a non-visual medium. Much to the consternation of the Cohong, their British counterparts did not take Lin's threat seriously. Instead of agreeing to turn over their opium, they argued that whatever opium they may have was actually not their legal property to give up, that it was instead the property of the governors back in India. This was a lie, but, you know, who gives a shit? That argument fails, but they assume that Lin's threat of execution is empty. And as it turns out, they weren't totally incorrect. The 3-day deadline came and went, and Lin didn't execute any of the Cohong. Good? Question mark?
It is, when I was reading about this in the book, one of the books for this podcast, The Opium War, it's kind of funny how it's like the Cohong merchants are like terrified because the Chinese are like parading them outside the factory with like in shackles and be like, we are going to kill these people. And the British are like, you're not going to kill them. Like these poor merchants is like terrified, and I guess we don't really know why, but Wien didn't kill them.
They've also been terrified because they're being shouted at by a guy with a thick Hunan accent. They cannot understand like more than a third of what's coming out of his mouth. I've been told that in China there's a lot of redneck jokes about folks from Hunan province.
Yeah.
I'm just going to assume that shit I see on Twitter is true because I am a responsible adult in the year of our Lord 2024.
Yeah. And taking charge of the situation in the factories was the then chief superintendent of trade, Charles Elliot. So Napier had been the guy in 34. The new guy is Charles Elliot. A former captain in the Navy, Elliot was well connected and relatively young at just 38 years of age. He personally disliked the opium business, but he put his duties as superintendent above his own feelings. Elliot arrived in the factories from Macau just as Lin began to place the district under an effective siege, blocking off all of its entrances with soldiers. His view of the situation was not optimistic. Not only did the Chinese have soldiers surrounding the factories, but again, as they had done in 1834, they had stationed fire ships along the river.
Enlighten our listeners who might not know what fire ships are.
So fire ships are boats or ships that you basically just pack with flammable material, and you can, if need be, basically like set a fuse on them and just send them drifting in the river currents down towards the enemy. And if they bump up against the enemy ship, they will explode, ideally, and catch the enemy ship on fire.
Very cheap, very effective.
Yeah. Seeing no other way out, Elliot convinced the traders to hand over their remaining stocks of opium. To get their agreement, he promised them that the British government would fully reimburse them for the value of opium, a promise he had no authorization to make. Still, this was enough to bring an end to the standoff. The British were allowed to leave, with most of them choosing to retreat to Macau. On June 3rd, Lin Zexu made the dramatic show of destroying the opium by having his men mix it in a series of large artificial ditches with lime and salt, and then flush it into the river. The agreement to turn over the opium failed to reverse the rising tensions between the two sides. In July of 1839, British and American sailors went on a drunken rampage in Hong Kong, resulting in the death of one civilian. When news of this reached Lin, he demanded that Elliot hand over the murderer for punishment. Elliot found this difficult to agree with, as he didn't actually know who was responsible for the death. Finally, on August 24th, the Portuguese governor of Macau announced that he had to expel the British from the city upon orders from the Chinese. That same day, a British ship sailing for Macau was boarded by an unknown Chinese crew, most likely not acting on orders from Lin, and its entire crew was massacred. With the situation clearly deteriorating, those that chose to remain in the vicinity of Canton, including Elliot, had no choice but to leave Macau and anchor their ships off of Hong Kong, from where the British set up a blockade of the Pearl River. This blockade would lead to the first major engagement of the war, when 2 British ships engaged a fleet of 26 Chinese ships on November 3rd. In a sign of things to come, the British sunk 3 enemy ships and sent the Chinese into retreat, while taking almost no damage in the process.
So 2 things. 1, all of this debacles with Lin Zexu, it feels like a weirdly modern political scandal. Like, you have all these like back and forths between parties. You have Lin making like these sort of symbolic, like him like flushing all of these drugs. Like, that's like for the cameras, Yeah,
yes, very much so.
There's deadlines that are then broken, and then nothing really happens. This is surprisingly bumbling. Second thing, I know you're not gonna like go into it, but I'm thinking about prohibition in America, and like I have no doubt that China was going through moral panics over opium, and like I'm sure people were like it was a topic of personal debate. A political matter, probably even from person to person, and we don't know who these Chinese people were who massacred this British ship, but like, wouldn't surprise me if anti-foreigner sentiment is sweeping the nation, maybe even being tied to this drug.
Oh, it absolutely is. There will be a lot of anti-foreigner sentiment in the cities and the countryside throughout this war.
So as news of the hostilities in Canton reached Britain, a debate parallel to the one in China was taking place in British government and high society. Far from being universally supported, the opium trade had many opponents in Britain. Much of his opposition was centered around the Anglican clergy, who viewed the trade as both fundamentally immoral and as an obstacle to their conversion efforts in China. Some merchants also thought the British would be better off dealing solely in legal goods to avoid the risk of losing all trade with China. A war with China would be potentially costly, at a time in which Britain was still repaying debts from the Napoleonic Wars. Indeed, the Foreign Secretary, Lord Palmerston, balked at Elliott's offer to fully reimburse the opium traders. Finally, Britain's attention was divided due to a civil war in the Ottoman Empire that threatened to drag Britain into war with France. For those wondering why the Napoleonic Wars were so costly, please see half of the episodes that this podcast has done in which Britain was bankrolling tons of states to lose to the French over and over.
Yeah.
Opposing these arguments was a strong opium lobby formed by the firms involved in the trade. This is like the OG Philip Morris. They emphasized the importance of the trade to Britain's finances and maintaining a positive trade balance with China. Some made the argument that the trade was not immoral. Opium was legal in Britain, after all, and if the Chinese emperor opposed it so strongly, then he should just get his own people to stop buying it. Most came to downplay the role of opium, however, casting the issue of one of British honor. Lynn had mistreated British subjects and threatened to end all trade with China. The British government had to intervene, and if that had the effect of bringing back the opium trade, which they cast as a minor side activity, then so be it. As for the cost of the war, that would be minimal, with only a small force being necessary, and the Chinese could be made to cover all the costs in the form of reparations after the victory had been achieved. It's gonna be fine! In the end, the government made the decision to send reinforcements to Elliot, quoting from the Opium Wars. Mindful of public opinion, especially religious radicals, the Foreign Secretary paid lip service to the evils of the opium trade, while hatching plans to ensure it survived and thrived. In a letter to Elliot, he wrote, "Her Majesty's government by no means disputes the right of the government of China to prohibit the importation of opium into China. Officially, the might of the British Navy would be sent to China not to promote the opium trade, but to protect the British colony there from another hostage situation orchestrated by Lin." Palmerston's letter accused the Chinese of trying to exterminate the British merchants, quote, "by the cruel process of starvation. British honor would be avenged." If the opium trade, which had provided a windfall in tax revenue for the government, flourished because of this military action, it would only be a natural offshoot, of course. So, we're going to get to this in the end, but it's interesting to me how, from the British point of view, this is all kind of, slapdash and, kicking the can and, it doesn't feel like people at home are making very hard decisions.
Yeah, for sure. Yep. As a new session of Parliament began in 1840, the government, then controlled by the Whigs, kept its intentions coy. But the fact that they were preparing a military response to the situation was clear for many to see. The Tory opposition introduced a motion to censure the government for its handling of the crisis, with the Tory MP William Gladstone, whose own sister suffered from an addiction to laudanum, giving a famous speech in which he declared, quote, "A war more unjust in its origin, a war calculated in its progress to cover this country with a permanent disgrace, I do not know and have not read of. Now, under the auspices of the noble Lord Macaulay," that was the Secretary of War, "that flag is become a pirate flag to protect an infamous traffic." The Foreign Secretary responded with his own speech. In it, he blamed the Chinese for buying opium, claimed that if the British stopped selling opium, then the Turks and Persians would pick up the slack, and stated that Chinese actions threatened the life and property of all those involved in trade with China. In the end, the vote of censure was narrowly defeated in a vote of 271 to 262. The war with China would take place.
Damn.
And again, like, I did feel it was necessary to include this because, as you mentioned earlier, the very simple version of the Opium War, and you can understand like why this would be like the high school versions. Like, the British decide to sell opium to reverse the trade imbalance, and like that's it. And then they go to war to make sure it happens. But it's like there is a debate in Britain. There are people who oppose this. There are people who support it. There are people with like differing motivations and whatnot. And it only goes through on a very narrow vote.
Do you think that like British merchants, and I guess like the East India Trade Company is not nearly as strong at this point, but like, do you think they would have initially just kind of got off on their own without government support, or are we seeing a period of time in British history where they are starting to get control over their foreign policy more fully, and that would have been possible?
Yeah, I think this is a time when they're transitioning to having more direct control over their foreign policy and less in the way of like, you know, what we'd call in America filibustering or whatnot. British reinforcements began to reach Canton in June of 1840. These included 16 warships, 4 armed steamers, indeed this war would see the debut of the steamship in naval combat, 27 transports, and 4,000 soldiers. This force set about blockading Canton and Shanghai. British forces stormed and captured the island of Chusan, which is just to the south of Shanghai.
Wait. Shanghai?
Yes.
Shanghai?
Yep.
Jay, you're supposed to say about 20 centimeters off the ground.
Why?
You weren't cool growing up, I see. Carry on.
Yeah. So British forces storm and capture the island of Chusan, which is just to the south of Shanghai, in July, suffering minimal losses. Both Chinese ships and fortifications proved almost irrelevant. The poor state of the Qing military meaning that the British would win every significant battle of the campaign, even when outnumbered. Remember, like, this is a part of this is that the Qing haven't kept up with military developments in Europe. You know, constant wars that we've talked a lot about before have pushed military technology along further, and also have just pushed like the need to have a very effective, well-drilled military. The Qing military, as we mentioned, is kind of underfunded, demoralized.
They haven't fought like a serious war in like 40, 50 years, right?
Yeah, for the most part, they've either been putting down peasant rebellions or like beating up on Central Asians. All the corruption we've mentioned affects the military in the same way corruption always affects militaries. I mean, if you remember like the whole like ghost soldiers, like non-existent soldiers you have on the payroll, that's the same exact shit that, you know, the Afghan National Army was doing in Afghanistan. So, yeah, it's not the best military.
Long, proud imperial tradition.
Disease, on the other hand, would not be so pliant. An outbreak of malaria and dysentery would eventually lead to 500 British casualties on Chusan. Just for like a note about Chinese geography, southern China is like pretty far south. Canton is on the same line of latitude as like Havana, Cuba. Chusan and Shanghai are like pretty similar to like New Orleans. So these are places.
Those Mongo Chongo mosquitoes.
Yeah. These are places which are hot and wet in the summer. As his military was being contained and picked apart by the British, the Chinese emperor remained largely ignorant as to the severity of the situation. The Qing court was full of yes men who routinely downplayed the threat posed by the British. Officers and provincial officials, including the otherwise honest Lin, turned defeats into victories in their letters to Beijing. One governor noted that British forces were weak due to their lack of bow and arrows.
That's some real 1v1 me bro energy right there.
Yeah.
The reality of the situation became more difficult to ignore when British warships began to appear in the mouth of the high river that connects Beijing to the sea. Faced with this threat, the Chinese reopened negotiations with Elliot. The new Qing representative, an official named Case Shan, proved more tactful than Lin Zexu. Still, an agreement could not be reached. The Chinese were unwilling to pay reparations to the British, and the British were unwilling to commit to an end of the opium trade. Keishan's more conciliatory attitude convinced Elliot the Chinese resolve was weakening, however. The British were also encouraged when he informed them that Lin Zexu would soon be fired by the emperor. Thinking that progress was being made and not wanting to keep his ships in an exposed area for the winter, Elliot withdrew to Canton. This withdrawal had the unfortunate effect of convincing the Chinese courts that the British were the ones whose resolve was weakening, thereby prolonging the conflict. No one has really correctly predicted anything in this sequence of events.
Yeah.
As Elliot treated with Keishan in the north, sporadic fighting had continued in Canton to the south. In August, Lin's men seized an English reverend as he was swimming near Macau, taking him hostage. Okay. The British responded by attacking Chinese ships and forces guarding the isthmus connecting Macau with the mainland, effectively driving them from the vicinity of the Portuguese colony. The Reverend and various of her hostages, around 24 from British shipwreck, would finally be released in December when Keishan arrived in Canton to replace Lin Zexu. I imagine that he's very stressed out having to put out these fires.
Yeah.
You always manage to find the put upon good boy busybody in these stories, Jay. I see you have a sympathy for these guys.
Perhaps. On January 7th of 1841, British forces, some 1,500 soldiers and a dozen ships, attacked the Chinese forts on the islands guarding the way to Canton. These forts were captured quickly, with the Chinese forces suffering around 600 deaths. The British, in comparison, had only 30 casualties, none fatal. The following day, the iron-hulled East India Company steamship Nemesis single-handedly repulsed a fleet of 15 Chinese junks on the Pearl River. Whoever named that ship Nemesis, I appreciate that. Yeah, good naming choice. With these defeats in mind, Keishan requested a ceasefire and the reopening of negotiations, which Elliot accepted. By the end of the month, they had negotiated an agreement. The terms of this agreement were simple. Formal diplomatic relations were to be established between the two countries, with no talk of tribute. The British would return all land captured during the war. They would also purchase Hong Kong from the Chinese for a sum of $6 million. The Chinese, in turn, would compensate the British for the war by paying them reparations, which rather conveniently happened to amount to $6 million.
Always got to make it look good.
Yeah.
No, we purchased this fine island.
The issue of opium, the cause of the whole conflict, went unmentioned. Unfortunately, both Elliot and Keishan's higher-ups immediately disparaged the agreement upon receiving news of it. Lord Palmerston viewed the terms as far too generous. He wanted to keep hold of Chusan, open up more ports for trade, and force the Chinese to pay greater reparations, including the amount needed to reimburse the opium traders for their losses. The Duoguang Emperor, who had been deluded into thinking his forces were winning, or at least fighting on equal terms to the British, abhorred the sale of Chinese territory. Neither side would ratify the convention, and both the negotiators would lose their positions, though Elliot would not receive news of that for several months, and the war would continue.
Seeing that Chinese forces were not standing down, Elliot continued the attack, capturing much of the area surrounding Canton. Elliot refrained from assaulting the city, however, as his force numbered just 2,200 men, while the Chinese had 20,000 soldiers in the city. Another ceasefire ensued, with the Chinese agreeing to pay $6 million to prevent Canton from being sacked. Finally, in July of 1841, Elliot received news that he had been sacked as superintendent. What? His replacement, Sir Henry Pottinger, arrived in August with a new round of reinforcements. What was he just taking too long?
It's like I said, The British government didn't like Eliot's agreement that he had tried to reach. They thought Eliot was too conciliatory. It was basically like too nice to the Chinese.
Okay, I guess I see it.
I mean, I guess like from their argument, the British didn't make any money. Like they got $6 million in reparations and then would pay that $6 million back to get Hong Kong. And yes, they would end up with Hong Kong, but they didn't make like a net profit. And also he didn't get the Chinese to open up any other ports as a part of the agreement. And that's something that like the British really wanted. They wanted to expand their trade beyond Canton.
And with their forces bolstered, the British began to decisively expand their war effort. Cities further up the Chinese coast, such as Amoy and Ningbo, were captured and Chusan reoccupied. Meanwhile, back in Britain, the Whig government had fallen and the Tories had come to power. And while in opposition, the Tories had largely opposed the war, they now support its continuation because you should never listen to what a politician says, you should only look at what a politician does. The British offensive continued apace in the following year. The village of Chapu, near Shanghai, was taken in June. To their horror, the British found that all of the Manchu soldiers and their families in Chapu had committed suicide to avoid the dishonor of being captured. Shanghai would not be so dramatic. The city fell to the British a few weeks later, its officials surrendering without a fight. From there, the British sailed up the Yangtze River to the great inland city of Nanking. Nanking was at the time one of the largest and most symbolic cities of all China, having frequently served as the capital at various points in history. Its fall would have undermined the legitimacy of the Qing dynasty. Finally realizing the urgency of the situation, the court dispatched officials to negotiate terms with Pottinger outside of Nanking. Obviously, Jay is much as a military nerd as all of y'all, and I've noticed that he's not really describing a lot of these battles, and I imagine they're mostly because they're pretty boring and uninteresting.
It's a lot of like endless, like British soldiers arrive at a fort. The Chinese fire a couple of shots. The British fire a couple of shots and storm the fort, and like the Chinese like all retreat, or surrender or whatever. They're very one-sided engagements. They're not the most interesting of battles for the most part.
On August 29th, 1842, the Treaty of Nanking was signed. The terms of this treaty saw China essentially fully open Canton and a further 4 more ports to British trade. Now, British merchants would be able to work and live in those treaty ports year-round. It also established exterritoriality. British subjects in the treaty ports be subject to British, not Chinese law. Hong Kong was to remain a British possession. Formal diplomatic relations between the two countries would be established. The Chinese would pay $21 million to the British. With that all said, the treaty did not go as far as to force the Chinese to legalize opium because, remember, the British either didn't want to admit to themselves or didn't say that was what the war was about. Even in victory, the British remained the facade the war was merely over honor, the protection of British subjects, and vague notions of free trade. Still, the opening of the treaty ports meant that any attempt by the Qing government to ban the opium trade was now practically impossible. The spice is gonna flow. And Nanking would be followed by similarly unequal treaties signed with France, the United States, and Russia.
The First Opium War would come to be seen as marking the beginning of China's century of humiliation. For the next 100 years, China would find itself increasingly at the mercy of a series of foreign empires. The shattering of the image of Chinese supremacy would have major ramifications on the development of both China and its neighbors, and the pernicious nature of the opium trade that led to it continues to inform attitudes towards drugs in the region to this day. For the British, it was a clear victory. They had displayed their military superiority at a relatively low cost of lives, and actually profited off of the campaign thanks to the reparations. Whatever moral stain might have been incurred in the process would quickly fade away, overshadowed in the public imagination by the fruits of imperialism.
That's the fucking Opium War, the first one, at least. A very strange, bumbling affair. Obviously, it's kind of hard to... I guess the Chinese falling behind in technology is an incompetence, but it's one that's kind of like boring to talk about. It's like, how far back do you go? And that's kind of a mess. I find it interesting that, like, again, the Chinese kind of beat themselves on this one, right? With all of the corruption and the economic instability, and then them just not being a functional state.
Yeah. Yeah, the Qing court's full of like yes men who flat out lie to the emperor about the ongoings of the war.
I think it's also worth noting that, modern states can't really control drug trades particularly well. And that maybe this kind of thing is just like an inevitable bomb on a society where addiction is this tantalizing considering the economic situation. And I think it's very important to remember the economic situation, which is always forgotten in history because people just want to talk about the fucking cannons. And yes, there were cannons. The British blew up a lot of people. Rough estimates, how many people died in this thing?
The Chinese, the British lose about 500 to disease. They're also, I didn't really talk about it, but there's like a separate incident where like around 200 or so soldiers and camp followers on a transport ship are shipwrecked off of Taiwan and are taken hostage and killed. So that boosts up the British casualties to around like 700 or so. The Chinese, it's hard to get a grasp on it. I've seen like around 3,000 military casualties. Not spectacularly high, compared to a lot of wars, but yeah.
Humiliation was the threat rather than like raw death.
Yeah, and because a lot of it is, there are a few cases where Chinese soldiers, particularly like Manchu soldiers, will fight to the death. In a lot of cases, a lot of the Chinese forces will just retreat or surrender without much of a fight, after firing a few shots. So yeah, it is very much a humiliation thing. To be honest, I didn't really know how we were going to tackle this this war when I first started doing my research, because it's a bit hard to beat up on the Chinese for being like, oh, you're incompetent because you didn't have the good guns, Because, the fact of the matter is, why Europe got ahead of everybody technologically, especially in terms of military technology, in this period of time is itself a huge topic.
Dissertation ass shit.
Like, in the large part, that wasn't necessarily a failing of other people's. It was just conditions in Europe led to the development of these weapons and these tactics.
But on the other hand, Chinese incompetence in governments, the unwillingness to raise taxes and actually reform the system, we see the arrogance against the British, and it takes a long time for them to address this problem because they're like, this isn't going to be a thing. This isn't going to be a problem. It's going to be fine. This is what I think is easily referred to as civilizational is a bit much. Government rot.
Yes.
And yes, the British were able to dramatically knock down the gates with their cannons and whatnot, but war only got declared because of the civilizational rot and the incompetence. And in many ways, you could argue that that's what actually won the war, or lost it, shall we say.
And I also think, and we could debate whether this is incompetency or not, but I do think it's something that's interesting for the parallels it has with, stuff that happens to this day, is you can argue the moral failings of the British government or the British people, to where opium was controversial in Britain. This was not something that, everybody in Britain was like, oh yeah, let's get these dirty Chinese addicted to opium and we'll make a ton of money. There were a lot of people in the British government and high society who opposed the opium trade for just reasons. And there was, like I said, there was a very close vote in Parliament to censure the government's handling of the situation. And yet, once it becomes clear that the British are winning, a lot of that just fades away. And, the Tories come to power, and for all their bluster and all their talk about opposing the conflict, they don't stop it. And, I think that has parallels with the way that, like, a lot of things happen in, and certainly in America to this day. You could think of, like, immigration, where, the Democrats might talk a lot about, like, the suffering on the border, and then when the Democrats are in power, nothing happens. I think it's an interesting, like, type of moral failing that will repeat itself in Western democracies.
It's also interesting how, like, most of this was not state against state. This was merchants against a civilization.
Yes.
Like, this was it's amazing how, like, asleep at the wheel the British Empire was during the part of history where we're all told that they, like, conquered the world.
Yeah, a lot of it kind of happened by accident.
Well, not so much. I mean,
almost
by accident. It was just individual merchants
it's
following
individual
profit
actions,
motive,
yes.
right?
It is individual disparate actions taking place.
But it's greed, and I think it's amazing to think about how, like, individual actions, individual greed, individual incentives of people can sort of, like, pile on one another to, like, write history textbooks.
Yeah, I mean, like I mentioned in the script, Hong Kong at this point in time was nothing. It was a couple of tiny little villages. And Elliot kind of makes the decision. It's like, oh, I'm going to include Hong Kong. Like, we get Hong Kong in the convention I'm writing, and it sticks. And because of that, Hong Kong develops to the city that it is to this day, one of the most important cities in the world. Like, it's just an individual action, not directed by the government in London, that ends up having a massive impact on world history.
So yeah, decriminalize drugs, and you won't have this problem. Also, smart people need jobs, otherwise your society starts to fall apart. Convince them to write novels. That will make them occupy themselves and most likely drive them to suicide. That is my official recommendation for any heads of state listening. And I'm going to be honest, we have been recording for 2 hours now, and my ADHD ass has completely fucking checked out. I am playing with a fidget. I am scrolling Twitter. I need this podcast to fucking end. Jay, do you have anything else to say?
No, that about covers it.
All right, I'm going to play us out and remind y'all to leave us reviews on all the places, diddle the algorithms, tell us about the podcast. We appreciate you. We love you. I would perform head on you if I could, and you know I got that good. Have a nice night, day, evening, life. Get out of here. Go listen to something else. I'm fucking done.